Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. This week, I wanted to talk a little bit about attendance in the House of Commons. There was a Globe and Mail story last week which gave this headline that the Conservatives had the worst attendance record at the special COVID-19 committee, and it was a bogus story. It was a completely manufactured statistic, and it makes a lot of assumptions about how attendance works in Parliament. And so I thought we should take a minute to unpack this and why this was such a bogus story to begin with. So the first thing to remember is that attendance in the House of Commons is not generally made public. But they do, the whip's offices do track it for salary purposes and so on, but those are records that are not made public. Consequently, the Senate does also track theirs, and theirs is made available publicly. But that's also because they have particular constitutional requirements around attendance, as well as there were some scandals a few years back around certain senators who basically lived in Mexico while purporting to be a senator in Canada, and that became an issue, and that was one of the kinds of reforms that was made to put some more accountability in place around that. So one of the assumptions that this story makes is that all 338 MPs are in the chamber at all times, and that's not how Parliament works. The only time that you get all MPs in the chamber in the course of a day are for question period and for votes. The rest of the time, it's a pretty small number, often just barely above quorum, which is 20. When they do debate on a piece of legislation or a motion, it tends to be a small number of MPs in the chamber who have what they call House duty, and they go and they read their speeches to one another, and they purport to debate at the end of each speech, which isn't really debate because we've basically denuded our Parliament of that, but suffice to say, that's kind of what happens through the majority of the day. The rest of the time, MPs tend to be either at committees, which meet while the House is sitting otherwise, or they're doing things like engaging with stakeholders or so on. So this notion that all MPs need to be there is, not a real one to begin with. Second of all, with this particular story, how they calculated that metric was by looking at the Zoom logins for these hybrid sessions, and then tried to figure out, some attendance record out of that. This is problematic, not only because that's just a made-up metric to start with, and B, one of the things we need to remember is that there are set speaking lists. It's a problem and we shouldn't have them, but unfortunately since the early 90s, we've had set speaking lists in the House of Commons. And if you're an MP who is not on the speaking list, it doesn't make any particular sense in this context for you to necessarily need to dial into the Zoom call and be one of 250 or 300 or whatever number was that they got up to. If you're just going to sit there and watch a screen, you can just as easily watch the proceedings on CPAC and get a better picture and better audio and generally better translation, because they're not affected by the same back and forth issue that they kept having with the Zooms in terms of which language you were speaking and which channel you were on, and so on and so on. And then add on top of that, because they're lambasting the Conservatives for having the worst record, we have to remember that Conservatives disproportionately represent rural ridings, and rural broadband in this country sucks. It's an intractable problem because the cost of providing rural broadband is more than it's worth to telecom companies. And yes, governments successively have been trying to work on this and providing subsidies and so on to make it happen. It's an ongoing work in progress, but let's remember this in the context of it's not going to be easy for every MP who is not on the speaking list to go through the time and aggravation of dealing with a poor internet connection or having to travel somewhere to get a stable connection to just sit on a Zoom call for 2 hours and not do anything. It's a waste of everyone's time and resources, and nobody comes out ahead in that case. So this is why trying to make an issue out of this is problematic. I know why they did it. It's because they wanted to show the conservatives were being hypocrites because they insist on having a return to Parliament and in-person sittings and saying, well, if you want this and you can't even participate in a Zoom call, then you're being hypocritical. But that's a ridiculous argument for all the reasons we've already stated. If they're having in-person Parliament, the theory is, yeah, sure, they could all be there for what was essentially question period, but not really. But again, in the current pandemic situation, nobody's actually proposing that either. We could have probably 100 MPs more or less in the chamber, appropriately distanced both in the chamber itself and in the galleries above. Because it's not like the public can come and watch, so we might as well use those seats as well, which is fine. But we don't need all 338 MPs in the chamber. So if we did have that return to Parliament with in-person sittings, the chamber would still largely be a small number of MPs through the course of the day. We wouldn't bring them all in for question period because there's no reason to, particularly because we've got speaking lists. So while you could have most of the ministers and a scattering of Liberal backbenchers, really fewer, not many more opposition members than are on the speaking list would need to be in the chamber. So, there's no grand point in trying to pretend that they would need all 338 in there. The only real sticking point, and it's not a real sticking point, would be around votes. And again, there's a way around that. They could do it in shifts, have MPs on the floor and in the gallery, have everyone count their votes, swap them out for the next group, count their votes, swap them out again if they need to, count their votes, and then apply that total to subsequent votes, presuming that there's no issue, and if there is one, then MPs could let their whips know ahead of time. And the Greens and Independents, can let their votes be known at that point as well. I mean, this is not an intractable problem. And it seems to me that it's being portrayed as one both by the government and by certain members of the media who are being somewhat deliberately obtuse in how they're trying to frame this. And so that's really, I think, what the crux is here. I mean, this was a false construction masquerading as an attempt to portray the Conservatives as hypocritical when it's not that at all. And so this is why we need to practice some critical thinking when we see headlines like this. And, media literacy doesn't help. It doesn't hurt there either. And that is everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.